The title of my brief remarks this morning are "We Are Not for Sale, Speech as Political Action in the Political Praxis of Micheal Manley." I want to begin by thanking again Honor, Ronald and Heather for working so hard to organize this workshop. Hopefully it marks a moment in the study of the Caribbean, and also hopefully it is about a certain kind of reflection upon our immediate past, done by ourselves, where we are not the objects of study, but subjects who make history in a capital with common H, as on about make history common H by our actions, but then write those histories with a capital H. These brief comments are taken from a larger project about modern Jamaican history and politics, but it has been a difficult project. It's been a difficult project to write because of many reasons, and one version of the manuscript was already being discarded. But it is difficult because well, how does one write about a past when you are part of that past? How does one write about a past when that past begins with you as a high school student in the 1960s, late 60s and 70s, a student activist at the University of the West Indies, a trade union activist, a member of a Marxist group, and then a journalist, and then a member of the People's National Party left. So in other words, how does one write? How does one begin to think about one's own life in a way, in what is perhaps the most tumultuous period in a country's post-colonial history, when for you, the struggle was about things larger than yourself, when the notion of sacrifice was not something that we spoke about, but rather we always spoke about a commitment to struggle. Of course, to do this, one has to be critical and to extend critique. But to extend critique in what kind of way? What is the modality of that critique? The tone of that critique? I would argue that the tone of such a critique requires not so much judgment, but quite frankly, humility. Humility because one has to account for the dead, the maimed, the lives lost in the chaos of defeat. And I say defeat, not failure, but defeat. So that how does one then write from the position of defeat? And what does it mean to write from the position of defeat? I state this as a kind of prefatory remarks because for me, the 1970s is not so much about a scholarly project. Rather, it is always about working through, grappling with the burdens of history. Not grappling with the burdens of history, but rather trying to understand a historical touchstone, one which punctuated the normal. Not just punctuated, but punctured the normal. Made an attempt to change the conventional normal. In a society in which there was the afterlives of 400 years of colonialism, racial slavery, and plantation life. Afterlives which structures the everyday life of people, the so-called sufferer, in quotation marks, in Jamaica. And everyday life that was constituted in what Rads Dizzy would call a certain kind of operation upon the actual self. What I want to do briefly here this morning is to take a particular speech that was given in September 1976, "We Are Not for Sale," at the 38th Public Conference of the People's National Party. To take that speech as a moment, to think about the conditions of the production of that speech, its performance and its enactment, and then briefly to address its afterlives. To take a specific speech means that we are actually looking at a specific moment. One is attempting to name a moment, not a conjuncture in the way Stuart Hall would argue, but a moment marked temporally by brief times, because that's how moments are. They are marked by times. Moments pass quickly, dissolve or fold into something else. But before they pass, they illuminate like flashes of lightning the contours of the present, the moment of possibilities, all together jostling and pushing each other, creating, if you wish, disturbances. And in these disturbances, we come to chant down Babylon. And in this chanting down, rebellion in these moments becomes a kind of momentary of revelation that calls forth the possibility of the new. So let us briefly sit with this seminal speech, "We are not for sale." To think through this speech proper is we need to account and to quickly sketch some kind of context. We loosely talk about the 1970s in the Caribbean in this kind of way. Firstly, there's the democratic socialism project of Micheal Manley. There's the Grenadian Revolution of 1979. There's the Trinidad attempted revolution in the 1970s. And then we actually forget that there was something in Suriname in 1982. In 1980. That between 1980 and 1982, that there was a revolution, and that the revolution began to collapse in 1982 with the murder of opposition, members of the opposition. We also begin thinking about the 70s, really think about a certain kind of afterlives. What went wrong in Grenada? What went wrong in Suriname in 1982? And what happened really in Jamaica in 1970? Who mashed up the country? Or was the country really mashed up? All these things, in my view, demand a certain kind of examination, not guided by nostalgia nor melancholy, but rather with a certain kind of critical analysis, both from the inside out as well as from the outside in. But I digress. Let's come back to the period, or to naming the period of the 1970s. I have called the period of the 1970s the long 1970s. And in many ways, I begin with 1968 just as a marker, although quite frankly, I do not like historical periodization, but I understand the necessity for it in analytical work. So I said, okay, let's try and see how we can name it. So that I'll name it the period of long 1970s, beginning in 68, obviously in the demonstrations in the Black Writers' Conference in Canada, the Water Rodney riots in Jamaica, the Black Power movements, the foregrounding of Rastafari, the 1970s revolution in Trinidad, the 79 Grenadian Revolution, the electoral defeat of the People's National Party in 1980, and then the implosion of the Grenadian Revolution. How to name this particular period rather than just saying it is the long 1970s? And the way I've tried to think about it is really what you're looking at in the Caribbean, particularly the Anglophone Caribbean, is that this is a period of radical forms of decolonization. That is, attempts at radical forms of decolonization. And that in this period of radical decolonization, there are many streams. And within the Jamaican stream, there's what I call the decolonized nationalism. Decolonized nationalism as distinct from a certain kind of Creole nationalism that created the Jamaican state in 1962. The radical forms of decolonization, as we know, means that there are things that happens that do not happen under the constitutional decolonization project. So the constitutional decolonization project essentially is a project about flying flag independence, no social transformation, no economic transformation, where the state actually remains the same. And as I said in the Jamaican case, what you have is Creole nationalism, formalizing the slogan of out of many, one people. What is, I think, important to understand is that that this Creole nationalism and, in fact, constitutional decolonization and the slogan of out of many, one people essentially reproduces the actual ways in which the colonial and the slave societies thought about the black people. the masses of the black people were simply not human at all. And it is in that particular context that one wants to think about the real remarkable achievements of Rastafari that made black people human by a detour to Africa and moving from Africa into a different cosmology and what about around questions of blackness. In this context of constitutional decolonization, which really nothing changed and things remained the same, by 1968, those of you who know Jamaican history would know the Ethiopian song, Everything Crash. And it is that moment of everything crash that one begins to see a certain kind of, not bubbling, but the congealing of what is bubbling inside the society. And one of the parts of this project, which I won't talk about today, which I spoke about on Monday, Monday, is actually how you can actually tell a history of this period sonically. That you can actually work through not the lyrics of the song, but the actual rhythms and the way in which the music developed or moved in Jamaica, and actually tell that period. And I would want to also say to you that that's a way of telling the story, which is actually paying attention or foregrounding the subaltern. In other words, it talks of really paying attention to the way in which popular struggles and popular lyrics and the popular and music, which in my view becomes a language of popular struggle, in the same way that art in Haiti becomes a language of struggle. That what you then get is a different kind of story about the period of the 1970s in Jamaica. 1972, the People's National Party wins, as many would know, an electoral victory under the slogan of the Delroy Wilson song, Better, B-E-T-A, Better Must Come. But also, very importantly, by 2 years later, in 1974, the People's National Party declares itself democratic socialist. And I think that is important because that declaration is a kind of ideological platform from which various things begin to happen. Equal pay for women, no bastard, the change of the masters and servants colonial law, so that for questions around illegitimate children, minimum wage, the Sugar Workers Cooperative Council in the rural areas where land was actually taken over by the workers, not the factories. The land was taken over by the workers, and some of us attempted to form a cooperative where the workers would actually control the sugar land. So the first time in 400 years. And that actually was a very, to me, one of the most important projects. Something I was involved in. I actually left university, dropped out of university to do that work. And what was interesting to me was to, coming from an upper middle class brown skinned family, was to recognize that people were living in conditions that they were living in the late 19th century. And to see the actual houses that people were living in those estates. And when you ask when was the houses built, you found out they were built after emancipation. And so that that particular project, which was a project around trying to, as I said, give workers land, but also had something else to it, which became very clear to me as I lived in West Orange during that time, and that was the question of dignity of black people. That for the first time in Jamaican society, there was a feeling that people call it raising of social consciousness. I call it dignity. That black people began to feel that it was Fury time now. And therefore, a Fury time now meant that was really congealed around this idea of dignity. The business of Fury time now, obviously, and all the reform programs that instantiated after 1974 and the enunciation of democratic socialism really meant that, really evoked, quite frankly, from the plantocracy and from the elite a reaction. And none of these things do not, the ways in which politics works is that if you're going to have a shift in the class relation, the class and color relations, then there are people who are going to be very upset. And what is interesting to me is that the thing that upset that elite most was not so much the Sugar Workers Cooperative Council, or even the bauxite levy, or even the minimum wage, but or the equal pay for women, or the Jamal programming, because we had 70% of the population who could not read and write at that time. What upset them was the National Youth Service Program. And I want to put it in the words of a high class, what we call in Jamaica, high class brown skinned woman, who said, "You mean to say my little Johnny have to now mix with my garden boy's son? You've got to be kidding." Right? So what you are looking at, and therefore in the 1970s, are ways in which the dignity of the ordinary black Jamaican was confronted the old colonial class and color and race relationships of the society, and that had been triggered by, not triggered, but that was now happening inside a mainstream party. And I think that to begin to understand the 1976 speech is to understand the following things. The context that I have just outlined, which is of the ways in which the elite was reacting, the business of dignity, and it is filled with time now. But very importantly, how those things in fact were now inside the mainstream political party. This is one of the unique features. In other words, all the black power, all the Rastafari, all the kind of ideas around dignity and about consciousness suddenly found itself inside the mainstream party, which is one of the reasons why the party also exploded in many times, because you had all these tendencies inside it that were trying to think about, or trying to fight for ascendancy in trying to make the Jamaican society move in a specific direction. So that I think is the background to the 76 speech. One more final background, which I just found out as I was researching for this, and it is this. Between 1974 and 1976, Micheal Manley, according to B.K. Duncan, who was then the General Secretary, was on the road every single week, which means he wasn't in the State Jamaica House. He was in the villages, he was in gullies, he was in churches, he was in people's homes, and he essentially was talking about socialism and talking about the actual program of the People's National Party. So if you think about that the actual Prime Minister finds himself on the road every single week, mobilizing and talking to people and about this business of democratic socialism and what it meant. The second point is something that gets lost in history, and that's because the focus is always on Micheal Manley. And the second point is that Beverly Manley, for those between 1974 and 76 as well, was also along, sometimes with him, sometimes without him, was chairing meetings at Jamaica House with the middle class people. That is the track. Again, in other words, an attempt to build a class alliance in practice. And where those meetings out, I'm told, was called task force meetings, and where she was trying to explain with her communication skills and so on around what it is that the party was doing. So what you therefore have leading up to 1976 is an actual mobilization that is going on. So 76 doesn't just happen just so. It happens. It is a culmination, I would argue, of all the things that I've spoken about, and then a set of mobilizations, political mobilizations that have taken place. Okay, so the day comes, September 19th, 1976. The conference is planned for the National Arena. Those of you who know Jamaica know the National Arena capacity is 15,000. But it is clear by a midday that with 20 to 25,000 people in the room, that this is actually not going to work. B.K. Duncan himself, who, as I said, who's General Secretary and who's on the road doing the mobilization, recognizes in that a week before the conference that something is happening that he says, I can't explain it, but I get a bounce on the road, is what he says. Right? And that bounce on the road, he says, makes it feel as if this is going to be a special conference. So he walks over to the national arena and quietly, without anybody knowing, actually just walks over to the national stadium, which is beside the national arena. And without anybody knowing, he actually sets up the meeting for the national stadium. Just in case his political hunch proves to be right. If it doesn't prove to be right, then he won't be embarrassed. So he doesn't tell anybody what he's doing. And he sets up the sound, the order fund, and who's the company he employs to come and do that. By the end of by 2 o'clock, it is clear that you're looking at about 40,000 people. All right? And so what then happens is that Duncan then turns to Micheal Manley and says, I have a plan. The plan is already hatched. I have a plan. All right? And the plan is that we walk over to the national stadium. And Micheal agrees, and they walk. Micheal leads the crowd over to the national stadium from the national arena. In that walking over, they're joined by about 5,000-6,000 more people. So by the time they get over to the national stadium, we think they really have about 45, close to 50,000 people. Micheal Manley looks at that crowd, and this doesn't quite know what to do. Those of you who know him who thinks he's just a fantastic speaker, which is really a great orator, obviously. But that one of the things about him is that he is actually very nervous to speak. Those many of you may not know, but I mean, those of us who worked in the PNP, and particularly in the PNP left, would know that for big crowds, you would see him drinking a glass of, you see him drinking out of a thermos mug, and you think it's water, but it's actually not water. Right? It's actually a small shot of Hapiton to kind of steady nerves, right? Because he actually was very nervous speaking to large people, large audiences. So he turns to Beverly and says to Beverly, how do we speak to these people? 50,000 people in the national stadium. And she responds to him, Micheal, think of theater in the round. Theater in the round. And I think you want to understand that. What does that mean? And she says he gets it immediately. In the interview I did with her, she said he gets it. And so when he begins to speak, there's a certain way in which he's speaking in an understanding of this is theater in the actual round. And the way in which, therefore, he has to move his body in relationship to the people in front of him, the people beside him, and the people actually, and the people behind him. The speech ends up saying, "We are not for sale," because that's actually not what the speech was supposed to be about. But in other words, what you have is a specific moment that is now emerging. That he himself, having been on the road for months, and Beverly actually doing the other work with the male class, and the set of conversations that the party left is actually having with him, and looking about him, and he begins his speech with "look about you," looking around him, I think begins to change. That begins to change, but makes certain shift inside the speech. So if you listen to the speech, there's the formal thing of party conferences and so on and so forth, and then you will see that the speech actually begins to change itself and ends up with two things: we are not for sale, and the last part of the speech, we know where we are going. And the know where we are going is actually a chant from the crowd, which he himself then picks up and then turns it back, and the crowd then begins to chant, we know where we're going. So Jamal program, we know where we're going. Equal pay for women, we know where we are going. All of that it comes out from a certain performativity that is happening on the ground, if you wish, at that specific historical moment in the national stadium. The speech also does a couple of things which I think are important. One, it emphasizes the question of sovereignty. We are not for sale. Secondly, it emphasizes the question of equality, that we are all equal. Thirdly, it talks about the dignity again of poor black people. And fourthly, for the first time, he develops an analysis of something called the clique. Right? And the clique then becomes the yo-yo of imperialism, the words he uses. And the clique then also, he identifies the clique. And he identifies the clique as those who have fled to Miami, those who have fled to Toronto, those who have fled to those who have left the country, and those who he argues are trying to turn back the Jamaican people. Turn back, he says, turn us back into slaves and to the colonial days and with the plantocracy. And it is at that point he says that if you don't want to give us investment because you want us to go back to those days, then we are not for sale. And we will find another way to do what it is that we're doing. It is a very defiant speech for those of you who, and I never thought when we were on I and Ronald were planning this, we said 15 minutes, I thought, okay, I'm not going to play the speech because it's so long. But it is a defiant, when you listen to it, you can find it on YouTube, it is a very defiant speech. It is a speech of defiance to imperial power and to the Jamaican clique, and therefore at the same time a speech of dignity for people. For poor people. I would just want to say to you that it is actually, the We Are Not For Sale theme was actually taken up by Maurice Bishop in 1979, after he made it in the speech Nobody's Backyard. It actually ends with a whole set of things about we are not for sale as well. So there's a way of thinking about the speech traveling if you wish. Let me just close a bit, try to close. Political speech, in my view, is also about action. Political speech, in my view, and the way I think about it within the Caribbean and African diaspora, is radical political speeches, speeches which overturn the conventional understanding of Wittgenstein about language being the limits of our world. Because in these kind of political speeches, language is not the limit of one world. Language is actually an opening to the possibilities of something else. Political speech, in my view, and particularly these kind of political speech, and here I'm thinking of Master Day Dunn, of Eric Williams, Bishop's Nobody's Backyard. I'm also thinking of a speech which I'm sure Alicia will talk about of Walter Rodney, one of the finest speeches he made in Ghana, is really also about political thought in action, or is political thought, rather, in motion. And I use the word motion deliberately because what you get, therefore, is a way in which things are being formed, incoherent, things are being congealed and formed at that specific moment. Right? Sometimes, and sometimes that's not so wonderful. In politics, some people will tell you because what happens after, right? But these are really critical moments, I would want to argue. Political speeches have become part of political action and create political thought in motion at these critical moments. I will also suggest to you that we as human beings insert ourselves by both word and deed into the human world. And therefore speech is not just a business of a means, is not just a means of communication. It is a way of intervening in the world. To speak is to announce presence. And public political speech is therefore, radical political speech is therefore both the announcement of presence and action. It is actually politics itself. And therefore, in this regard, I would want to argue political speech, or a particular radical political speech, becomes a material force for us. As a performance of political speech, and one I've tried to describe the one briefly, the We Are Not For Sale, is really creates a certain kind of atmosphere, yes, but also creates, and quite frankly, a kind of new ground for politics. In this regard, by 19th September, the We Are Not For Sale speech in Center 6 stands as one of the seminal speeches in the history of Caribbean political speeches. One of the afterlives of this was that there was a written manifesto and program that was done outside of the speech, before the speech. The speech was 2 months or 3 months before the December election. That actual manifesto was thrown away. Nobody looked at that manifesto. The speech then became the actual manifesto of the December 1976 election. And that, I think, is interesting because it also is significant because the election manifesto was written by David Coe. And you have to think about the actual balance of forces in the party at that time, and therefore how right after the speech nobody wants to look at that manifesto. The speech then becomes the actual manifesto itself. What I then, so it creates therefore a new ground, I would argue, for the elections and for the PNP and for the country. Couple of questions and then I will end. Was the country at that moment in 1976, did the speech in 1976 reveal that the country was at a revolutionary moment? We will never know in hindsight. And one, in fact, should not try to judge the past in that way. What I think we can safely say is that for a brief moment, a certain kind of decolonized nationalism had become radical decolonization, and that a new opening had appeared at that moment. And then the moment faded. It faded and faded away. And we were left at the end of 1976 with Max Romeo's War in Babylon, Tribal War in Babylon, and it's simple out there. Thank you very much.